National Library, Kolkata, Ministry of Culture, organizes a series of webinars during the COVID-19 pandemic. Especially today, we are started one more series, especially for the young researchers and the students, research scholars, under the team Ek Bharat Shrestha Bharat program. So today we start the program with the evidence of Sangam Tamil corpus of literature in tracking the post-Indus legacies. Today we have with us our honorable beloved Dr. Balakrishnan sir with us to deliver a lecture in the topic. So once again I thank you Dr. Balakrishnan sir on behalf of Director General and on my own behalf to accept our invitation and spare his valuable time with us today to share his experiences in the past 30 years in the field, especially which he lived out in the archaeology and in the team of Indus. So I welcome you, sir, on behalf of DG and on my own behalf today in the webinar. So I request Dr. K.K. Kochukoshi, our officer on special duty, to welcome our guest and introduce our guest today to the participants.
Yes, ma'am. I'm new to your GoToMeeting environment. Right now, you are able to see me or my screen. Which is visible right now?
Koshi, sir?
Right now, which one is visible? Screen is visible or me is visible or both?
Both. You are visible. You are visible.
Both are visible.
Is a PowerPoint is visible? Yes, sir, it is visible.
Sir, I'm not able to hear your voice. Please unmute yourself and started your lecture. Hello? Koshi, sir?
Yeah, you can hear.
Okay, fine.
Hello?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
I can hear you. I can hear you.
Gajalakshmi, there is some problem with you.
Hello?
Hello?
Can I talk now? Can I start now?
Please carry on. Please carry on.
Koshi, sir, we are not able to hear your voice.
But he can hear.
No, I can hear it.
Yeah, but that means Gajalakshmi, you have some problem.
Did you hear my voice now?
Yeah, I'm hearing.
Achha. Shall I start?
Okay, let me start then. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Okay,
welcome everyone to the National Library webinar under Ek Bharat Shrestha Bharat program. Today we have with us Dr. R. Balakrishnan, an ex-Indian Administrative Officer who is presently working as the advisor to Chief Minister of Odisha. Sangam literature is the earliest known literature of South India. Traditions and legends linked to 3 literary gatherings around Madurai, Pandya capital. The first is believed to be around 4,000 years ago, and the next is around, second is around 3,700 years, and the third over 1,850 years before Christian era. The oldest surviving text is a Tamil grammar, Tolkapian. Ettu Tokai, Paditipattu, Akadanura, Purananura, Madurai Kanchi. There are so many classics which contains a lot of history in it. Sangam literature is a trove of history. Dr. Balakrishnan is an expert on Sangam literature. He is a postgraduate in Tamil literature and a researcher with the Manimalai University of Tanjavur. He is well known on Indus Valley civilization also. He is a writer of repute in Tamil. He is a poet. He is a well-known lyricist. He has knowledge of Sangam literature to such an extent that he could be able to link Sangam literature and the Indus Valley civilization. And we are happy to welcome Dr. Balakrishnan to this webinar on behalf of the National Library I extend a heartfelt welcome to Dr. Balakrishnan. You may proceed with your lecture, sir.
Thank you very much for your introduction. Of course, for me, are you able to hear me?
Yeah, we can hear. We can hear you.
Yeah, others may switch off the mic. Actually, the others mic may be kept on muted thing, so that your environmental sound and other thing might interfere, and others may keep the mic on muted condition. That would be helpful. Thank you very much for this particular opportunity, and particularly I'm very happy to be part of this, and I'm very familiar with your National Library. Almost last few decades, I've been a regular visitor and a great beneficiary of wealth. There are, in fact, in my own research, there are certain many aspects and many important documents I could spot in your library, particularly when I was looking for the after the John Marshall's announcement about Indus Valley civilization in 1924. Then the first response came from Calcutta. Before getting into the formal talk, I would like to rather touch upon your library. Then immediately after a few months of the John Marshall's announcement from London, the first response anywhere from the world, it came from Calcutta, from the great legendary linguist Sunit Kumar Chatterjee. In the Modern Review, there was an article in the September. The announcement came from in September 24, but this response came in December of the same year. So that means within 3 months, he came out with the thesis linking the Tamil civilization and the Tamil literature, the Sangam literature, and the elements of the Dravidian culture, and also the elements found in the archaeology of the Indus region, Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. To that extent, I can say that what I am today presenting before you, the seed for this particular talk was sown in the very place, that is Calcutta, by none other than Sunit Kumar Chatterjee. And that is the reason the scholars in the Indus Valley, particularly those who subscribe to this particular view, always look at the Sunit Kumar Chatterjee's contribution with a great, grateful awe and inspiration. So thank you very much in that sense. Thank you. Glad to meet all of you. When I was asked that I would choose a topic for today's webinar, I prefer to speak about the evidence of Sangam Tamil corpus of literature in tracking the post-Indus legacies. The reason is very clear, because let me just give within first few minutes, let me set the agenda, why this topic is needed and what I am trying to say. All of you know that in the Indus Valley civilization is one of the greatest and the oldest civilization, a Bronze Age civilization, and most urbanized civilization of the ancient world, for that matter. And no doubt that within the South Asia and Indian subcontinent, that is the ancient of all. So then, but till that particular civilization was brought to the notice of the world by the announcement, no one had a clue. That is the beauty of it. No one had a clue that such a thing is existing. So that means any narrative prior to the announcement of the Indus Valley civilization about India was based on other documents like Vedic literature and other documents. You can't blame anybody for that matter. We must keep one thing in mind, that we talk an academic issue and we need to have an open mind. And then, and personally, I subscribe to the pluralism. It's been my personal philosophy also. Whenever we, during the course of this talk, Aryan, Dravidian, these kind of words, these words do not have any racial connotation. It has got a linguistic connotation. And then, so this has to be kept in mind because that the new DNA study metaphor. We are a melting pot. But in America, in recent times, that the melting pot as a philosophy or for that matter metaphor is being resisted, because that in melting pot, what happened in the crucible, many metals are put together and melted, and then its new alloy comes, that all the constituent elements loses its identity. But in India's case, for that matter, it's a case of any multicultural society. That is not the case. You don't make a new alloy, but then many things are coexisting. That is the reason we talk about the pluralism and the multiculturalism. So that way, the melting pot as a metaphor is not, it's rightly losing its sign, and people are talking about the different idioms. So in off late, people talk about a salad bowl, and a salad bowl, that in a bowl where there's a lot of salads are kept, and each one find an equal space, but there's a lot of colors, like a carrot and a radish and white, green, and all these things. So then some people say that it should be compared with a salad bowl. But I am not in entirely agreement with also. I am trying to propose that during the course of this book, in my recently published book, The Journey of a Civilization from Indus to Vaigai, that's a book was published sometime on 16th of December from Chennai. And then after the post-COVID, we could not do the program. I was supposed to have a book reading in Calcutta also. It could not take place. We are under the lockdown and all this thing. So then in that book, I proposed that we should understand our culture as a kind of a rainforest, where the rainforest as a metaphor will be much more suitable for the idea of India, because that it's in rainforest, everything coexists, from the forest floor to the middle order to the for its a canopy to the overshoot, it's everything coexists. So that way, I put that particular metaphor in French. Coming back to where we started, till 1924 announcement, there was absolutely no idea about what is Indus Valley civilization, what is Harappan civilization, because there was no evidence about it. Even archaeologists went to Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, it's an accident. Somebody found that a lot of people are removing brick boulders, in the sense that bricks as a blast material for a Lagur railway project. The contractor was using the people. They were bringing excellent bricks and using that as a blast material for the making the railway. Then the engineers were surprising where this material is coming from, equal type of brick. Then they tried to see the source, and they found the Harappan location. So it's an accident. Even when the professional archaeologists went, then they all felt that first it is a Buddhist stupa, because for us, the understanding of the structure started with the stupa in India, Buddhist stupa. So even the mound of the Mohenjo-daro and Harappa was initially understood as a Buddhist stupa. Even they were looking for that which period, they took it for granted that it has to be Buddhist stupa. But then only after digging, they found a totally new type of civilization, which is something unknown to the Indian imaginary. That means the uniform size of the brick, and then a town layout, and the upper side, upper town, or the citadel thing, and the lower town, and the uniform streets, very without any kind of any change, deviation. It's a very excellently worked out streets. And then the drainages, particularly for the running water drainages, and particularly the drainages from the bathing and other kind of sanitary locations of home, and then some kind of public spaces, particularly some open space and granary, and a kind of place, a swimming kind of or a bathing kind of got, where there is a dress changing arrangement. And also that floor of the bathing location is it's actually done with not only different type of brick, so that it doesn't slip, and also in the gap they have utilized a bitumen, so that it becomes the first watertight, or what I kind of leak-proof bathing got of the world. So that means it's a very sophisticated civilization. You can only say that if something you have to make an analogy. Today, normally people will say that it's a New York City, Manhattan, or Times Square. If something called Times Square or Manhattan existed in the ancient world, I mean that about 2500 BC till 1900 BC, if something like a Manhattan existed, it existed in Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, Indus Valley civilization. There is nothing comparable to that anywhere in the world. This is one side. Suddenly, there is a lot of speculation come that if such a great civilization was in Indian subcontinent, what happened to that civilization? How come we didn't know it? How come no literature in the surface level in Indian literature? Surface level means what? It's a northwestern India. In North India, we normally have a tendency to look into the North Indian literature, like say Vedic, to start with the Vedic literature and the early Sanskrit literature. So that means you are not getting any input which will directly connect. That means which is a characteristic feature of the Indus Valley civilization. Then we need to know that what is the characteristic feature of Indus Valley civilization. Number one is urban life. Number two, the dominance of the mother goddess worship. And then the religion was not in the center stage, because you have no evidence of that kind of thing and all. But then, if at all you find some kind of terracotta figurines or any material, it's the predominance of the female figures and the mother goddess type of worship thing. And then the town life, and more importantly, the trade, the flourishing trade, maritime trade. That means their contact with the outside. Like a Mesopotamia, Sumeria kind of thing and all these places. So trade, urban life, dominance of the mother goddess worship, and these kind of fortified locations, and the use of brick. So suppose you make 4 or 5 elements, and then the absence of horse, and then the dominant presence of the tiger, and so many elements. If you all put together, then suddenly people started asking. That is how the Sunit Kumar Chatterjee from Calcutta. Of course, R.D. Banerjee also is from Calcutta. He's one of the archaeologists. That way, Bengal and Calcutta has got a frontal or a role in the shaping of this particular narrative about Indus Valley civilization. There was an archaeologist from Bengal, and also the first linguist who came from this particular hypothesis was from Calcutta. So that way, there is a sudden disappearance of this particular civilization. The question came, what happened to them? That means the people now in this particular nearly about, it's going to be 100 years coming 2024, another 4 years, it will be 100 years, 1 century of the announcement of the Indus Valley civilization. But even today, no one is able to finally say what is written in the text. There's a huge amount of text is there, particularly the seals are there, but we are not able to read it because we are not having a Rosetta Stone type of bilingual script to read the Indus script. So because there is no bilingual script available, everything is in a speculation. So nobody is agreeing with the another person. There is a deadlock. So that means there is a question about how Indus Valley civilization came to an end. Who were the authors of that civilization? What language did they speak? Did they speak a single language or many languages? So there is a lot of question mark. All these question mark put together, I would like to call that as one of the great riddles of Indian prehistory. So talking about the prehistory, some of you must be familiar with the idea of prehistory. There is one of the international scholar Glenn Daniel, he once made a statement that the prehistorian is witness to the sad fact that the ideals perish, and it is the cutlery and chinaware of a society that are imperishable. And he also specifically talks about the Harappan and Mohenjo-daro. He says at the end of the day, the prehistorian has no idea what went through the minds of the prehistoric people, what was their ideology, what was their culture, what was their civilization. We end up only holding the cutlery and chinaware. So he specifically talks about in the idea of prehistory about Mohenjo-daro and Harappa and the figurines and drainage and all. So this on one side, this undated prehistory of India as having a huge question mark in the form of the Indus Valley civilization. Then how the Sangam literature comes to picture. So that means before going to that, we will leave this particular question. Around that time, the Indus Valley civilization area is much bigger than the Sumerian Mesopotamian civilization and the Egyptian civilization put together. Then it will not be even equal to the area wise, the spread wise to the Indus Valley civilization. Some people are making even speculation because it's very difficult to make a census into the around 5,000 years back. But people do make a comment that the Indus Valley area where the civilization spread was equal to the 10% of the world population of that time. We are not sure about it, but no doubt about it, it was a thickly populated area. Then suddenly, for whatever the reason, X reason or Y reason, A or B, whatever the reason, that civilization comes to an end. The question comes that what happened? What happened to that particular civilization? Whether did they stay back, or they continue to mix? And so what happened to that civilization is a question mark. And second riddle of I want to first introduce to you. The second riddle is that there is in the down south, there is a group of people. They speak a language which is identified with the Dravidian family of language, and they are very conscious, self-conscious about their antiquity and their. Am I audible?
Sir, yes, sir.
Yes. So that then they are very conscious about their literature and other thing, and there is a literature which is called Sangam literature, the collection of literature, which is basically dated something around 300 BC to first 2 centuries of the Common Era, say around more than 2000 years back. So then there is a question mark. There is a question mark about the antiquity of the Tamils. They always carry that particular question. What is the origin? There is some theories about Lemuria continent theory, and they came from after continental drift. They came from what is known as the lost continent, Lemuria, and they moved towards the north and then established what is now known as the Tamil kingdom, Chera, Chola, Pandya. And there is a question mark about their origins. So that means I consider that as another riddle. So that way, Indian prehistory has got two riddles: the riddle of Indus Valley civilization. Another is the riddle of the Sangam literature. The screen is visible.
Yes.
Yeah. So this is the idea of Glyn Daniels, the idea of prehistory that issue. So then, let me introduce the Sangam literature. The Sangam literature, when I try to introduce, let me give you a glimpse with what is Sangam literature. It is more than 2000 year old, 2381 poems, 26,350 lines of poems written by 473 poets, includes 30 women poets. I would like to underline this. More than 2000 years, out of 473 poets, more than 30 are the women poets. That means even today, I don't think that nearly about 8% of the writers are the women writers. That means unless the education was far wide and spread, the education was far popular and very widely popular, then you will not get 30 women poets out of the 473 poets, and education has to be far well rooted. So then, and second thing, the literature is by and large is very secular literature, and more importantly, the inputs available in the Sangam literature, it does not, in my opinion, talks about the current Tamil Nadu only. There is a lot of elements in Sangam literature which is of the pan-Indian character. It talks about the region which was where the Chera Chola Pandyas found themselves in 2000 years back, but much beyond that. It talks about the other parts of India with a very acute intimacy. It's not a hearsay. So how this literature or the people who composed the literature came to know, familiar with this particular location. Then before getting into the presenting my evidence, I would like to quote Asko Parkola, one of the greatest scholar the Indus civilization studies have found. That is in the Asko Parkola. He says that the old Tamil is the only ancient Dravidian source, not much contaminated by Indo-Aryan languages and traditions. That means all other Prakrit and other traditions must have got a greater influence from the Sanskrit tradition. Relatively, Asko Parkola says that the old Tamil is the only ancient Dravidian source, not much mixed by the Indo-Aryan language and thing. So that makes it an important candidate. So then we are having two questions before us: how the Indus Valley civilization came to an end, how the Tamil tradition started. I am over a period of studies, my studies started sometime in serious studies I started in 1988, more from the almost about the last 32 years, 33 years. I carried my studies wherever I'm posted. It's been my parallel existence of me. And my understanding over a period of time only it's evolved by working in Orissa, and my postings also as an Indian Administrative Service Officer. It gave me a lot of opportunity. I was in the Election Commission of India, which took me to the nooks and corners of this country. I have been to, except maybe life afforded me that maybe less than 15 districts which I would not, in India, which I would not have physically visited. I have been to all the states and union territories, bearing about 15 districts, each and every place, whether it's a Northeast, whether it's a Bengal, all the districts of Bengal, all the districts of Bihar, all the districts of Uttar Pradesh, 70 districts. Like this, throughout India, my job took me. So that means since I had this interest, I could widen my understanding and horizon. So with this one, I would say that what this Sangam literature says, because I know that I am talking to a very select audience who may not be familiar with Tamil literature, and they may be new, so that I don't want to load them with a lot of Tamil stuff, which they will not be able to grasp and follow. But I want to just say that there is if there is some mountain spoken to in Sangam literature, the maximum number of time in detail what has been discussed is the Himalayas. And then you may ask, what is a surprise? Himalaya is one of the greatest mountain system. Many literature talks about it. And what is the surprise about the Himalayas being mentioned in Sangam literature? But the way in which it is being mentioned, that is more important. It mentions in such a way that the intimate knowledge of the Himalaya is needed. The intimate knowledge about the anatomy of Himalaya, the upper reaches of Himalaya, the yak that lives there, and also associating Himalayas with the arrival of the people known as Aryans, and then the kind of feud with them, and then comparing the southern with the northern traditions and Himalayas, so that in the dichotomy, when the Sangam literature is building, and Himalaya comes in a very dominant way, and the intimate knowledge the Sangam literature putting on the table. To my knowledge, I have read the other literature which talks about the Himalaya. I pursued the trial of yak in other literature. Even I have consulted some Tibetan literature. I went to Ladakh. I went to Indo-Tibetan research centers, and also the Kalidasa's literature, and all the literature which talks about the yak as a yak, the animal, as a kind of simile in the literature. But no literature which talks about the eating habit of the yak. The eating habit where it goes for where it lives, the higher reaches of Himalayas, and it eats a particular grass which is fragrant. Even today, if you go to Ladakh, or for that matter, anybody is familiar with the Tibetan and other area, and in the Tibetan side of the China, and there is something you can Google and find out something called aromatic tea, which is known as yak tea. The yak tea is becoming aromatic because of the aromatic grass the yak eats, and the milk gets the aroma and it's passed on to the tea. That is called it is called the yak aromatic tea. So this aroma mixed, the fragrance mixed, its fondness for the fragrant grass has been clearly identified in few places in Sangam literature. Whenever yak is mentioned, invariably Himalayas mentioned, and particular grass and its name has been mentioned. I try, and then this kind of detail is not available in any other literature. Then more than anything else, the first Tamil grammar Tolkappiyam is prescribing a grammar, prescribing a kind of a tradition, how the male yak should be called, how the female yak should be called, how the baby yak should be called. So what should be the concern of this Tolkappiyam, the first Tamil grammar, how the yak will be called, because yak does not live in peninsular India, how it gets into the grammar, how it gets into the literature, how the intimate knowledge about the eating habit of the yak. So then, which is not found elsewhere. So that means this, we have to keep it in mind. I'm leaving these questions with you. And I'm only giving because we will have a more, I would rather welcome your questions so that it becomes kind of a little participatory matter. Second thing that the Sangam literature, which is the knowledge about lion. Many of you must have read, there's a lot of books have been written about lion in India. Particularly today, the lion in India is only in the Gir forest. And it has been documented that once upon a time, the lion in India and lived up to even Bengal. It was hunted down. But what has been documented, Valmiki Thakur has written an excellent book, Ancient Aliens. I think there are so many books have been written about the lion. So in the wild condition, the Asiatic lion is found only in the Gir forest today. But then it has been very, very clearly documented by paleozoological and other people who have made a study that lion never crossed the south of the Narmada. It has spread in the Gangetic side up to even Bengal, but it's never crossed the south of the Narmada. That means its boundary is the northern bank of the river Narmada, which has been repeatedly written by many people. But whereas the Sangam literature, while dealing with the lion, it identifies a specific chieftain, the forest area chieftain, and his region, here lions are found, how they look, their anatomy, and their fight with the elephant, and the lion that killed an elephant, and all these things with an intimate detail has been dealt with in the Sangam literature. And then it is not that hearsay. See, if the lion is one animal, it walks into the different literature and different culture without physically being present. For example, people say Singapore is named after the lion. So that, but Singapore never, the lion would have never left. For that matter, even in the Western culture, the lion is considered to be a symbol of the royalty. But in many cultures, civilization, the lion is actually not existed. So that means the lion goes through the idea, the travel also migrate through the idea. But in Sangam literature, it does not travel as a migration of the idea. It talks about a specific Tamil king, and he has got a part of the Tamil prehistory, and then and his area, and that particular chieftain's area in this forest, the lion and its anatomy, and what are the important aspects of its anatomy, very, very clearly talked about. I know that this is a lion region, how the Sangam literature captures it. Then I will come to that. Why I am telling this, I am only giving the essence of my argument. The Sangam literature contains certain what you call memory, back memory, or the flashback memory, which was not exactly belonging to the socio-political and linguistic boundary of the Sangam people in the around the beginning of the Christian era. That means where Tamils found themselves 2000 years back, what is mentioned in Sangam literature was much beyond that. So let me again introduce a camel mention. Again, Tolkappiyam, the first Tamil grammar. You need to know about the Tolkappiyam. Tolkappiyam is the first Tamil available grammar. But in the Sangha and the Tolkappiyam, more than about 25% of the couplets in the Tolkappiyam, nearly about more than about 363 times, there is a reference about the previous grammar work. He always quotes the previous work. But those previous work, we are not having access to it. That means it is not the first book. This is the first available book. In that first available book, there will be more than 360 times the reference has been made to the pre-existing grammatical work. There is a prescription in the tradition how a he camel will be called, how a sea camel will be called, how a baby camel will be called, and then how the camel should be the concern of the Sangam literature. Was it a camel which was taken in a zoo or in the garden of a king or in a temple in ancient Tamil Nadu? No. This camel is put in a natural environment, in the desert environment, where the traders are carrying their mercantile material. That means it is the load carrying animal, like how the donkey is carrying a load, how the bullock carts is used for the bull is carrying. Like a donkey, it is being used for carrying, like the way in Rajasthan, it carries the load. In Gujarat, some part you will find that camel cart and camel carrying the load. So like in any desert. So here the merchants are going, the merchant material is going on the back of the camel, and the camel suddenly finds itself totally starved for 6-7 days of not eating. Suddenly, they out of hunger, the camels start eating the bones of the perished animal. You know that I've been, for this purpose, I have traveled to Jaisalmer. I have been in touch with the people who do the research in Bikaner, the Camel Research Center. I have consulted international literature available on the camel behavior and ascertain in what circumstances the camel will eat a bone of the perished animal. And people now, the science understands that if there is if it does not have anything to eat almost for many days together, out of the desperation, it will start eating anything. Another second reason has been found that if there is a shortage or the what you call inadequacy, like it's anemic, it's not having a phosphorus or like a deficiency, due to certain deficiency, and then it will have the urge. Something you must have seen that the animals have the habit of licking the salt. This is called salt craving. Like that, due to the craving and something like start eating bone, so that it needs that kind of element available in the bone, either out of hunger, whatever the case may be. In a particular specific context in the desert, the camel will end up even eating bone. Anywhere in India, nowhere in India, there is a lot of literature has been written about the camel. I come across a Sanskrit literature which talks about the anatomy of the how to purchase a camel, how much rate can be given, what type of camel, and it's what you call the Samutrika Lakshan. We say that you know, even those who are buying a bull, they will know that whether the bull is good. We say it will be work will it work very nice? Will it carry load? There is some kind of element. Even there is a book is available to how to fix the rate for the purchasing bull, but no literature in India talks about the habit of the camel, which is carrying a mercantile load and end up eating bone. This is only one literature. Again, there is a mention about the camel sleeping on the seashore, where a poet looking the drifted wood from a long distance. He thinks that for him it looks like a camel putting its head on the sand and sleeping. So such a kind of imagery. That means it has to be a kind of a place where near a seashore, as where that camel has to live. Then such a kind of environment available today only in Gujarat. The camel carrying the weight load can happen in India only in Rajasthan and Gujarat. So how the Sangam literature carries this imagery, how it got into the literature in such an ancient Tamil literature, not actually influenced by the other tradition, talks with such a kind of authenticity. That means the pre-history of Tamil has got some connection with these regions, these camels of Gujarat and the thing and all. Then I will come to the another animal. This is Asko Parpala also dealt with this. This is Indus seal, Mohenjo-daro, seal number 290. This seal has been dealt with by many people, depicting wild ass. See, wild ass is something, you know, in the Ran of Kutch, in the Rajasthan, in Gujarat, in the Ran of Kutch, those who are familiar with that area know that there is the wild asses of Gujarat. In the whole of South Asia, for that matter, the entire region, only place the wild ass is found in a wild condition, in a sanctuary type of environment, is only in Gujarat, the wild ass. That is the only location where this wild ass has also been domesticated and used a kind of load carrying draught animal, like a horse. It is something like a mule. It is being used for carrying some draft. Some single person can travel in that donkey cart or a wild ass cart, or it's also carrying material. When Sangam literature, Indus Valley civilization, so far, horse has not been found as a picture. Right now, there's a lot of controversy has happened in the past. Depiction of the horse in I would like to avoid those kind of discourses, but the fact remains that in Indian Indus Valley script, or for that matter seals, nowhere a horse has been found. In some places now people are say that the horse bones have been found and all in some other area, but then fact remains that it's widely acknowledged that the absence of horse, and there is a depiction of the tiger as well as wild horse in a particular seal number 290. Then will you believe that in Sangam literature, this particular animal is called Atiri, and then it is used by the individuals for something like a small rickshaw, or that means a cart pulled by this particular type of donkey or a wild horse or domesticated horse. So that means it's being used for a single person just to travel. So then in that particular text, there is a depiction that when a guy is returning to meet her lover or the wife, when he is coming back from after going to a faraway place for earning money, he is rushing. Then this animal is rushing through a backwater area. That means where the sea, like you know that those who have traveled to the Kutch, you will know that there is the backwater area where the salty marshy land. Salty marshy land, it's called in Tamil Iringali, and it's a backwater marshy land. Through this marshy land, salted or saltwater marshy land, when this animal is carrying him, this animal is limping. Why it is limping? Because in that particular backwater area, marshy land, some shark, you know that the shark fish, it has been hatched by the mother shark, and then the baby shark is biting the leg of this particular animal, and because of its limping. That means whether it is a fact or a poetic imagination, there is only one place where a shark baby and a wild horse could have met, is only one location. It is nowhere else, because only in the backwater area of the Kutch side is the only place where the shark comes and breeds. And then that is the only area wild horse is found in the natural location. And there is no other place in Indian geography which will match this particular depiction in the ancient Tamil text. So this is the question I purposely raised it, because that a lot of people in Tamil Nadu also, because many eyebrows were raised, because that this is putting the Tamil prehistory in a larger Indian context, because this goes counter to the existing belief within Tamil narrative that they belong to further south in the Indian Ocean area, in a place called Lemuria, and that continent has sunk in the ocean, and then they migrated towards the north and reached the present Tamil Nadu. This is the popular narrative. This is known as Kumari Kandam theory or the Lemuria continent theory. So when I come with a counter narrative, it raised many existing belief, but the fact remains that I was getting guided by the fact my studies was taking. So then another this is regarding the flora and fauna, which I mentioned about. The Sangam literature deals with the geography, which is not exactly coterminous with the geography of the Tamils in 2000 years back. That means it contained some kind of carried forward memories of the locations and the events and flora and fauna associated with the prehistory. That is my hypothesis. Then how to prove that? So then if you have to make a statement that the Indus Valley civilization, the post-Indus legacies have to be within India, have to be tracked, then it should be, if it is a Dravidian hypothesis true, then you should naturally look into the ancient most Dravidian literature, that is Sangam literature. That is the first argument. If this is true, that means Sangam, Indus Valley civilization was once occupied by the ancestors of Tamils. If it has to be true, then there has to be a telltale marker. You cannot make a wild statement. You cannot say that this is a Tamil civilization or the associated with the Tamil civilization or a Dravidian civilization or a Proto-Tamil, Proto-Dravidian, whatever the name you call it. You cannot make a wild statement. There has to be some kind of telltale markers. I put a litmus test for my own studies, because since I am doing it for last almost about 35 years, I've been very, very guarded and measured in making public statement or bringing out my study. It took a lot of time. I was not in a hurry, because I'm not a full-time researcher. I no career to pursue. I have no expectation from my studies except the search for truth. And since I was doing in a part-time way, I took my own time, and I was trying to first convince myself before talking. So I wanted what I call is a two-way litmus. What is called two-way litmus? Like a litmus test. it should be verified from both the ends. That means, if it is true, like Sunil Kumar Chatterjee told, the way Asko Parkola proposed, or the Airavada Mahadevan talked about, if it has to be some sort of Dravidian or a Proto-Tamil civilization, there has to be a telltale marker in the very region where once upon a time Indus Valley civilization flourished. Second thing, there are certain things which is unique to this region should be verifiable in the ancient most Sangam literature and also traceable in the modern Tamil life also. These three markers I kept for myself. Only if passes all the three tests, I was telling myself I will speak about it. Otherwise, I won't speak because I have nothing to defend. I have no agenda. In fact, I have nothing to pursue, nothing to prove. I'm a free-wheeling researcher. So, but I put this particular condition to myself. So, what they left behind, what they could have left behind, I thought about it. So, right now, today, what do you mean in Punjab? So, in Punjab, Punjab-speaking people will be there, and Haryana, Hindi and Punjabi-speaking people will be there. And the entire northern region, other Indo-Aryan language speakers will be there, and then composite Indian culture will be there. But then, what can be beyond, other than the Mohenjo-daro and Harappa and other archaeological material? What other material would have been left behind? Then I came with the idea of the place name. The place names we have to understand. It's known as toponymy. So the study of the names, it's called the onomastics. If you go on Google for onomastics, it's called the study of names. If it is study of place name, it is a toponymy. If it is a study of the people's name, it is called that one is called I will just run through the slides so that in fact I was talking to you. This is a bone-eating camel. We discussed about it. We discussed about the oil losses of Gujarat and the Indus Seal M290. Right now we are in this place. Okay. So the place names are very, they don't get peris the way human peris. They remain witness to the emergence of a civilization, flourishing of civilization, and even the death of a civilization. But the place names remains. And then place names are also carried by the people. When the migration takes place, large-scale migration, people what they carry? Do they carry their cart? Will they be able to uproot their house and carry on their head? No, they cannot carry their house. Can they uproot a tree near their home and take it to a new location? No. So today, recently we found a lot of people walking from one end of the country to another end of the country during this Corona period. What they were carrying? Maximum their luggage, their children, and what they carry is the memory. So when a large-scale migration takes place, people carry their memory, their gods and goddesses, faith and faith system, beliefs, and their memory and their collective consciousness, and along with that, place names and people names. This is what they carry. There are a lot of ways where you can prove this. That I think, what is America today? The America was before Columbus. Why Columbus went to America? Columbus went to America because he wanted to find a sea route for India. Because instead of coming to our India, he ended up to the America because he took a wrong route. And then in the process, a new America was founded. But already there is a red, what the Europeans called as a red Indians. Because they were looking for Indians. And they found them red and they called them red Indians. Then after that, this India came to be a thing and all. And we are now East Indians and they become the West Indians. That is the reason West Indies cricket team is there, West Indies there. So West Indians and East Indians, but we have nothing to do in common. But then people went in search of India, ended up in America. But then today in America, what is common? Hundreds and thousands of the place names of Europe, depending on who went there. If the Spain people went, Spanish name went. If the Germans went, German names went. If the British went and the British English name went. And region after region, the European names found themselves in the American new continent. That is how there is a York and New York, there is a London, there is a Paris, there is an Amsterdam, and any number of places. Either Scottish place, Irish place, German place, particularly Spanish place, you will find hundreds and hundreds of names relocated there. Then again, other than the Native Americans' name, then there's an Afro-American, like an Africans. The people, how they landed there, they were taken as slaves and kept and sold. This is what the American history is all about. Those people, when they're carried there and they created their own small settlement, what they did, they gave their old African names in the America. So that way, African names travel to America. That is how you find the Nile as a name of a small river in America. Egypt is a small village. Like that, many African names found its way in America because that Africans traveled there. Within India, you take the example of the Parsi people. You know that in the Parsis, they live in Bombay. You find Parsi population is there. In Gujarat, they are there. And they have their own religion. Zoroastrian religion is there, then the Parsi. And then these people, what they carry, because they have a known history of the recalling that they were the natives of the Persia, what is right now known as Iran. In the Persia, then due to some persecution, they left and they took 3 ships and reached India and landed in a place called Navsari in Gujarat. But what they carried, so now we know that one of the very important, well-known industrialist of India, Ratanji Tata, and the Tata, the family name, the Tata is the name of a village in Iran. And then Nariman is a well-known lawyer of India. The Nariman is a place name, is a Parsi, is a place name in Iran. Like that, in the Parsis of India, carried their place names as their surnames. In most of the surnames, like Bengali surnames, I have done a separate studies about the Bengali surname, Oriya surname, and the Indian surnames. I have done thousands and thousands of Indian surnames, unique surnames, and found that most of the Indian surnames, we carry it Jena, Samal, and all these, except few names. And most of the Indian surnames are actually the place names. Actually, place name. Place name, I have come across even, it is carried as a surname in India and found as a surname, place name in India itself, and also found as a place name in Iran and some other place, or Afghanistan, or the current Pakistan. But there are some names I have found the place name only outside India, but here it's the surname, like in the Parsi name. So that means I have proved through various case studies. I have done a case study on Jews, and I have done a case study based on the movement of the Jews from the Poland to Russia, Russia to Poland. And Jew case study, a lot of studies have been made in the Jerusalem University. And also I've done a case study on the Parsis. I have done and other case studies on the European population in America. Because all these things proven, I have relied on the place name, because I didn't want to make a wild statement. So if that is true, then if it is a fact that once upon a time, Tamil prehistory had something to do with the northwestern part of the India, what they must have left and what they must have carried and replanted is the names, place names. With that particular hypothesis, I started searching the place names and the geographical feature name of the entire northwestern India, generic names, geographical feature, specific hills, specific rivers, places, capitals, port, battlefield, and recalled places. All these names cannot be imagination. I compiled a glossary of the names mentioned in Sangam literature. Place names, capital names, port name, hill names, river names, clan names, and the ruling family's name, individual people name. Like that, I created a dictionary of the name in the Sangam literature. And I have a huge database with me over a period of time from the late 80s, 88, when the first time when I was introduced to a computer in a place called Koraput in Orissa. For the first time, I saw what is a computer looks like. Those days, it was a DOS prompt, MS-DOS. You cannot do this. There is no Windows or that kind of a sophisticated computer. You have to go and type and copy, save, and then there is something called floppy. All these things from then P1, P2, and then 280, and 286, 386. Like this, then Windows came, and then the database also Lotus 123. And every time there's a Clipper and Fox Pro, Visual Fox Pro, and the SQL. And as the database was enlarging and new avenues were coming, in each level I have maintained my database, because that I started in early 90s, the computerization of the place names of India, and for that matter surrounding India, and then slowly I built up a global database. So then my database, when I did a program on search engines and created, I found many peculiar names which the current Tamil people will not be able to identify where it is. Such a peculiar name like Vallam, Mullu, Alisi, Nannan, all these people, the prehistoric characters and towns, specific incidents associating with the Aryan invaders who ran away in fear from the very famous Mullur town, Natrinai 170, and Vallam town, and the forest of Cholan Alisi, Nannan who killed the bright, proud young woman who went to the bath in the river. All kind of events. It's not recalled. It's a recalled places, recalled battlefields, recalled events. There is a carried forward memory. These places I have compiled and located them was a lock, stack and barrel in this area, which is I called it a Kurkai Vanji Tondi. This is a Kurkai is a port town of the ancient Pandyan king. Vanji is of the ancient Chera, and Tondi again ancient Chora. I did not even use this. You see that Madurai. This Madurai, the ancient name of the current Madurai is only Madurai only. Airavada Mahadevan keeps saying, but even now I did not take it. Though I'm a native of Madurai, but even now I did not take I did not name after Madurai, because that people may easily connect that with Mathurapuri and other kind of later concept. I wanted to choose some name. There is no other linguistic tradition or no other literary tradition in India makes a claim that should be unknown to them. It should be in the exclusive domain of the Tamils, of the prehistory of Tamil, without which you cannot build a Tamil identity. This is my precondition. That means how you cannot build the identity of Mahabharata. How will you prepare without using the term Hastinapur or the or Kauravas or Pandavas or Arjuna or the Dhritarashtra? These are the names without which you can't build a narrative of Mahabharata. Like that, there is something, a name without which you can't do the identity creation of the Bengal. You cannot avoid Pala kings and Senas and other associated with the Bengali history. You cannot build a narrative of the ancient Kalinga without the name of the Karavela or Kalinga, Udra or Utkala. These are the names which will. Can you build a narrative of Odisha without using the name Puri or Jagannath? Like that. What is Jagannath and Puri for the Kalinga and Odisha? I wanted to pick up something from the ancient Tamil text, without which you cannot build the Tamil identity. So then I found hundreds of names. I wanted to call this as a Kurkai Vanji Tondi complex. If you go to Google and look for Kurkai Vanji Tondi complex, you will have access to some of my talks and papers. So this is all the places. It's only representative names I have given. These are all in the Sangam literature, recalled memory, Sangam text. Just the exact replica. It's frozen like a fossilized material in that area. I will almost come to an end of my talk. And you see that many of you who are in the regular habit of reading a newspaper and the television channel must have recent times must have come across a sport called Jallikattu. It is called, I will not kind of bull fighting, I will not use the word. If you really understand the ancient Tamil text, it is called bull vaulting. That means where a man is the bull has to be a humped one. It should be Jebu bull. There is a hump. This is the hump of a bull. This is a Jebu type bull. And then a person has to go, he can only go and catch hold of this hump only. So this is a popular sport. And this right side, what you see, that an industry. Are you able to see the slide?
Yes, sir.
Next yeah, the slide is seen, huh?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes. We are able to see it.
Okay, you see in the right side there is a one particular animal, bull. Is a tossing. There are 5 guys in the picture. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Then I was really confused whether it's whether one particular person being tossed around, whether like an animation picture, he is in the different location, he goes and falls. From there he goes and falls. Whether it's an animation type of if it is an animation, this is the first animation of the ancient world. But we come to a conclusion, it is not a one fellow, it's a different people. One fellow fallen here, one fellow fallen here. Why? Look at his head. The head is pointed towards this side. Head is pointed towards this side. And this fellow has pointed out towards this side. A same person cannot have a fall in 2 opposite directions. So it is a 5 different people being tossed around. If you come to Tamil Nadu around Pongal time, It is Pongal is nothing but our Makar Sankranti time, January 2nd week. Around that time, the sport is observed near Madurai. It's very popular in different parts of Tamil Nadu, particularly southern and central Tamil Nadu. It is held particularly southern Tamil Nadu, but it's a Madurai region is very famous, where the Kiladi excavations are taking place, where the evidence for the Jabu full has been found and has been proved in the laboratory in Pune. And this photo, we took it in 2019 January. We took it. We kept this photograph. We wanted, we told the, because I have seen as a student, I have gone and witnessed this particular event many times. It was in my mind that I have seen people falling like this. But during those days, my days when I was in school and college, there was no photography, this kind of facility, motion picture. I specifically made a request to the photo cameraman to position himself and capture. He took hundreds of photos. I'm not presenting himself. How, look at the man, the way, the direction in which he is absolutely vertical, 90 degree. And all is like we have built a huge thing. What you find here in Kalittugai is a running commentary in the Sangam literature written 2000 years back about how the ground is prepared, how the bulls are prepared, how these guys are ready, how the girls are witnessing the sport, how they are thinking about the valiant guys who are going and embracing bulls. What is in the mind of the bull? The bull is thinking that I will go and pierce the stomach of only an able-bodied young man who is fit enough to challenge me. Even bull thinks that I will not go and hit everybody. If I have to hit, he has to be a fit guy. And the boy thinks that no, I will not catch any other bull. I will catch the most notorious bull. So that means it's a kind of a sport where this must have happened in the concept where the pastoral life, where the domestication of animal must have been very important in the human life. Around that time, it must have happened. Today, if at all, the bull sport is there in various forms in Himachal Pradesh, in the present Pakistan, in other parts of in Haryana and other places. But it's like a race of the bull and then bull vehicle race and many forms. But this particular form is very unique for the Tamil Nadu, and it is popular in the ancient literature. It is found in the Mohenjo-daro, and above that, you must have read it in paper. In recent times, there are people who made an attempt instead of taking this as a kind of a part of the narrative of the carried forward memory. And obviously, people can have a different viewpoint. So a view was taken that this should be banned. So then there's a ban was announced. Then sometime there was interrupted. Then new rules were prescribed. When there was a ban was there was a huge crowd in 2017. Thousands of youngsters. Those youngsters have nothing to do with this sport. They are not the guys who are going and tamming. They are the well-educated. They are the IT guys. They are the working in IT companies of Chennai. They are all assembled in Marina Beach, and thousands of people. It was a very spontaneous movement. And finally, the sport was with certain conditions in the presence of some judge and the collectors and SP. They will do this kind of thing. The testing. Nobody uses the alcohol. The health of the youngsters checked. The health of the animals checked. It's regulated. All with this regulation right now. It's welcome. It is happening now. But the fact remains that you look at this one. This particular image of the Indus Valley civilization, this running commentary from the Sangam literature, this is a 2019 picture. In the TV, you will find the running commentary. When I hear the TV running commentary on January 15th or 16th, I recall this Kalittugai. When I see this particular picture, I recall this particular seal of the Indus Valley civilization. This is what. I will just give one more evidence. Sangam literature talks about a different type of wind. I have found in my studies, it's a part of my book, Journey of a Civilization, the frequency of the wind pattern in Sangam literature. The chill wind comes from the northern side 55 times, eastern monsoon wind 8 times, and breeze from the southerly breeze only 4 times, and the westerly wind, hot wind, is 42 times. So we put it in a kind of diagram, and this is a direction. This is how the wind rose is prepared for the in the airport. When you make a airstrip, when you want to create somewhere a plane has to land, people create a wind rose based on the past data, maybe last 100 years wind data or last 60 years wind data, and that is how you will find that landing place. The wind directions are the runway. Sometimes the runway taking off side will be decided based on that. So then I put this in the Sangam wind, particularly the hot wind, which is with a huge, like a Lu. You know that in the North India there is something called wind called Andi and then Lu. And this kind of hot wind, which is carrying the sand, which is sufficient to even a palmyra tree become the half height, which is Sangam literature says. It's like a fire like ember it talks about. The northern wind is so chill, even the birds are crying, even a crab in the ocean side, the crab is running for cover because the wind is so cold. Such a wind from the northern side in the present Tamil Nadu will not find. For the present Tamil Nadu, the northern is only Telangana and Andhra. Andhra is hotter than Tamil Nadu. If at all something can right now come from the northern side of Tamil Nadu, only hot wind can come, not the chilly wind. In the western side of the present Tamil Nadu, we have only the Western Ghats. The Western Ghats is under Kerala. From that side, it's what rain shadow area. When the southwest monsoon comes, this is hit by this particular Western Ghats, and the rain comes only to the Kerala and other places, and then it gets into the other parts of India, and India gets the more rain, and up to Coimbatore region and Nilgiris only, Tamil Nadu will get rain. Most of the rain in Tamil Nadu, we get it from the retreating monsoon, where the monsoon again comes from the northeastern side and catch some water also from here and then gets into Tamil Nadu. That is the reason we get the rain in the October-November time. That is the time they think. Look at this one. This is a windrows map for the Ahmedabad. Ahmedabad airport windrows, pre-monsoon and post-monsoon and winter. Through the meteorological department database, we prepared the windrows for the Ahmedabad and compare that with the Sangam. If you create a wind mass for the literature, and then it's an amazingly the wind, which the geography and the wind location, Sangam events and the animals and flora, Sangam literature is talking. It is not only talking about the present Tamil Nadu, it is talking about a prehistory which was much beyond the scope of the present Tamil Nadu. If so, what they were doing there. In the Indus side, there is a question: who lived here, where they went, what they carried. And then from the Tamil literature side, where this guy came from, how they came, where they came from, and where they landed, what they carried. This is a question. This is what two riddle. Now near Madurai, in Kiladi, I often go to that particular location for the archaeological location. This is a Kiladi finding. This is a Sangam reference. Precious gems and stone ornaments, gold, agate, Carnelian beads. So in Madurai Kanji, in Sangam literature, merchants who buy lovely gems, pearls and gold and sell imported things from the fine countries. The name often written in Tamil Brahmi on the pot's thread of the Kiladi, and the long established Eel town of Anduvan Satan of great renown, famous Adan Ali Si. All these things are in the Sangam literature, found in the Tamil Brahmi, what we call is a Tamil script, and these are the references. Conch bangles. I think the K.N. Dixit has spoken. He was the Archaeological Survey of India director many times. He worked with Mortimer Wheeler. He worked with John Marshall. He's the very renowned archaeologist. He was also for 6-7 years, if I rightly remember. He was the Director General of Archaeology. After 1931 report of the John Marshall, 1939 he visits Chennai. In the Chennai University, he delivers a historic talk where he mentioned that in the Gujarat and side, the continuity of the industrial civilization, evidence, particularly concept. Even today in the Gujarat side, people are wearing lot of the visuals in the Mohenjo-daro and Harappa and the Indus sites are people are seen wearing conch shell, but these conch shells bangles were sourced only from the southern parts of the India, pearl and conch shell. He makes a suggestion somewhere near Purkai side, near to side. The archaeologists should take a very, very focused effort. This statement is made in 1939 by the Director General of Archaeology in Tamil Nadu, in Chennai, in the University talk. It has been printed. I have a copy of it. He was requesting archaeologists to focus, and he says that if you focus, you have every chance. My innocence says, I have an intuition. I am convinced that if you focus there, you will find the evidence that will connect this location either contemporary to the directly to the Indus Valley civilization or some timeline which is subsequent or immediately following the Indus Valley civilization, but you are bound to get it. This man told in 1939. It is almost 80 years now. We are now getting it. If somebody has to blame, we have to blame ourselves that we have not in the really tried to locate the truth in the proper places. So, but in K.N. Dixit, here no bias. Probably I too have. I'm a researcher with an open mind. But the K.N. Dixit is not expected to have a biased view in 1939, asking archaeologists to look for the conch shells and connect it with Indus Valley. And brick walls and other burnt brick structures, Agananuru 375, and this is what we are locating in the Keeladi. And cell bangles found in Keeladi, unfinished cell bangles found in Goladora in Gujarat, and it is in the Indus site. And the dice made of terracotta, ivory, and cubic in Keeladi. And then reference in Sangam literature, including the cubic dice. The cubic dice only can create the number 10. When you use the 2 dice, see, you cannot build the Indian history without a reference to dice. That is what Mahabharata is all about. But where is the archaeological evidence? Archaeological evidence for the cubic dice comes from the Indus area, from Gujarat side, Lothal, and other places. Then in Keeladi, then the reference, a very, very authentic reference in Sangam text, where the possibility of getting number 10. The number 10 in the dice can be found only in the cubic dice. If you get both the dice, you get 5 plus 5, 10, or one is 6, another is 4. 6 plus 4, 10. Only in these 2 instances, you can get a 10. So Sangam literature talks about getting a small number. It talks about getting a repeat numbers in the dice game. It also talks about the happiness of getting 10, number 10. This number 10 can come with the Lothal dice and the Keeladi dice, read with Sangam literature, you will find better. And again about the ring wells, I mentioned about Sangam text and found in Keeladi and other places. I mentioned about the dice, the Lothal dice. This is what the Lothal dice. This is a cubical and elliptical dice found in Keeladi. And I already mentioned that is what the Sangam literature talks about, getting the 10, number 10. If number 10 dice can be found only in the Lothal type of Indus and the Keeladi type of Tamil archaeology and a Tamil literature. Except in these 3 locations, you won't get this particular combination. And then spinning wheels and cotton and underground pipes. And then above all, this is, I will conclude here. Look at this Keeladi graffiti found there. You must know that of all the inscription, maximum number of inscriptions found are in this. And then if you particularly the pots threads with the graffiti markers, if you found there, 100 found, 80 found only in the South India, particularly in Tamil Nadu. And this graffiti marker, which looks like Indus sign, this is Indus sign number 225. This is the graffiti marker found in the Keeladi, in the pot threads. This is Indus sign 307. This is Indus graffiti marker. 365. This is the corresponding marker. Can you match this? Can it happen accident? It looks like a high tension power line. And look at this. And look at this one. So then B.B. Lal, the renowned archaeologist, long back he made a statement sometime in 1962, if I rightly remember. He made a statement that the graffiti markers of the things found in the stone and the pot threads of Tamil Nadu are comparable with the Indus. Probably they represent the emergence of the new writing system. There was a void. There is an Indus which we are not able to read. Second, next time we are getting only the Kharoshthi language and Ashokan Brahmi, and then Tamil Brahmi, it is considered. So this is somewhere it links the writing system. The graffiti comes in between the Indus writing and the graffiti marker. B.B. Lal has told in sometime in 1962. I have not presented all the evidence. I only wanted to take through you this particular concept of how the post-Indus legacies has to be traced in the Sangam literature. Sangam literature should not be treated as a regional literature, regional written in a language in the regional. It is a pan-Indian literature. The first urban literature in India, any literature which celebrate urbanism, that means urban life, cities, port town, they are celebrated. Even Sangam literature is so obsessed about the urban. Even when you are singing the beauty of a girl or her forehead or her beauty of the face, then they say that she is as beautiful as such and such town. Suppose suddenly somebody comes and make a statement to a girl, you are so beautiful like Howrah Bridge, or you are beautiful like a Kolkata, or your forehead is something like a looking very nice like Kannada place. No, then you will find it very strange enough. But so much obsessed about the life in town and the urban city, Sangam literature is the only literature which talks this kind of similes. Throughout the Sangam literature, celebration of urban life. The first two epics, the first epics of Tamil Nadu, Tamil, Silappadigaram, it invokes the sun, it invokes the moon, it invokes the river Kaveri, and it invokes the Pumbugar town. There is nothing else is invoked, no God. It invokes a town. I don't think that any other place, instead of God, a town is invoked. That is the obsession of Tamil literature with the urban life. So that way, Sangam literature is the first urban literature of India, first pan-Indian literature where it knows the Himalaya, it knows the yak, it knows the bone-eating camel, it knows the anatomy of the lion lived in the place of oil, and it talks about the ass-driven cart and the ass being bitten by a shark baby. And all these things are having a pan-Indian nature, which other literatures are not able to touch it. And then this is the first maritime literature where celebrates the maritime life. You cannot think about Indus civilization without a maritime life. At the same time, the historical period, all the Pliny, Ptolemy, Peripulus of Erythraean Sea, everybody talks, when they talk about the trade with the Western countries, you cannot build the narrative without the port towns of the peninsular India, because they only had the sea in all the three sides. The sea traders of the Indus Valley civilization would not have climbed up some other hill and become a hunter and food gatherers. They would have only followed the route. A sea-based fellow will follow only the sea-based coastal location. A trader will only follow the trader. Maybe right now we are finding the corona type, the pandemic is totally throwing the world economy to the topsy-turvy. When we reboot it, the town people are going to the rural area. That would be the Indus Valley also probably rebooted after the demise of the Indus civilization. That legacy, Sangam literature is one of the evidence literature where the literature can be found. With this, I would like to do my speech. I would welcome if you have any question. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, very much. Can I put some of the issues raised by you? Very interesting lecture. Can I raise one or two issues? Sir, I'm Koshi here.
Please.
One thing I wanted to know is that these Kiladi and all people, if they have come from Mohenjo-daro, they should be the first generation people because they still have first-hand knowledge about lions, camels and all. One. Second is, have you any contact with the Berhui language, which is used in Balochistan, related to this Sangam literature? And one more thing which you have said is about surnames, because we are librarians, we are more interested in surnames, especially the names of people. And I feel some of these surnames are caste names, or they're depending upon the job they do, like Sonar, Karmakar. These are some of the work they do. And lastly, I wanted to tell you about these Bengali old people. They used to say that when they die, Sindhu Nadir Opare, on the other bank of Sindhu they want to go. So that means they always feel that they are migrants. They have come from a place from the other bank of Sindhu. The old people even today they say that. So I think, can you relate any of these things?
I'm glad that you mentioned about it. I'm also aware of that. Going one by one. Number one, it is absolutely impossible that the Kiladi people, they are the first generation direct, because there is you must be aware of it, there is a huge time gap between the demise of the Indus Valley civilization, which is normally considered to be 1900 BC. Okay, there is a space gap and the temporal gap. There is a gap in time and space. So first we will deal with the time. So the demise of the Indus Valley civilization is normally considered to be 1900 BC, Normally, people talk about the what is considered to be the Mahabharata age is something around 1500 BC and all, but we are not getting into that. It's something around 1900 BC. Indus Valley civilization came to an end. Whereas so far we have found the evidence in the south thermoluminescence and the carbon dating for certain material in Korkai and Adichanallur in Kiladi. Some thermoluminescences and the carbon dating goes up to the 1000 BC or something at 1100 BC, but mostly it is in the region of the 500, 600 BC, even this something around 800, 7th, 8th century. So that means still there will be a gap of something around 1000 years, minimum 1000 years remain unexplained, which we have to treat as a temporal gap. Probably in the future archaeology may bridge this particular gap. Unless that particular archaeological gap is built, it would be very, very wild imagination to say that they made a non-stop journey from the Mohenjo-daro and landed in Madurai. It is impossible. But we have to bridge this gap only through the carried forward memories embedded in the Sangam literature. This is what I consider that a Sangam literature as a conduit for a lost past, a predated, undated past, both in terms of the spatial and temporal. In Sangam literature, there is a song which talks about a poet is telling a king that you are a migrant. He says that your ancestors, 49 generations before you, were ruling a place called Thuvarai, which is a completely very walled city. In the city's walls were looking like made of copper. Made of copper, it need not be a copper wall. It could be a very brick wall that means strong and red color. So then where he talks about a 49 generation, normally generation is calculated every generation 25 or 40 years means something around 1400, 1500 years back. But it's a speculation. So there is still a spatial and temporal thing. But of course, during Kiladi time also, there must be a trade contact between the northwest and north. There is undoubtedly the Sangam literature talks about it. But I would consider it's a multiple way of migration. One migration I am suspecting the Pandyan migration, which is sea route or the driven by the some kind of calamity like a tsunami. I am not subscribing to a continental drift or the entire continent going under the Indus, the Indian Ocean, because new studies even few days back, very good evidence emerged using GIS and satellite imageries. There is nothing like an entire continent having sunk in Indus Ocean. So it's like even if a continent is sunk in, it cannot take only the Pandya region, not the Chera and Chola. So I am relating that to only a tsunami type of event. The tsunami we ourselves saw in 2004 in front of our own eyes, how the towns can be affected, the lands can be affected. So it could be some kind of a natural disaster, which the Tamils are still carrying in their mind as a calamity associated with the sea. The Chola people associate their calamity with a sandstorm. They say that their capital was completely buried under the sandstorm. Entire peninsular India, no capital town can buried under the sand. Such a kind of sand will not happen in peninsular India. It can happen in Rajasthan, it can happen in Gujarat and some other location. It cannot happen. That is a way their past association with the prehistory associated with Indus Valley, it is emerging out. Second thing, answering to that your query of certain names, there is no doubt about that. If you take 100, I have done a empirical study. I took all the surnames, unique surnames through a computerized program using a huge program. I did it and found all the unique surnames. The surnames of various kinds. There are few surnames or title. For example, somebody is named as Acharya or Upatyayo or something like that. These are titular, a title given by a king or something connected with your occupation. And then there are occupational thing and titular. But most of it, I can say, even I'm now trying to do an algorithm thing and all, I can say comfortably about 70 to 80% of the names which we think as a caste name. It is not actually caste name. It is to be identified as a caste name, but actually originally it is a village name. Like normally, if you see that when you go to other country, you are identified from your place of arrival. If you go to America, you are just Indian. After that, you are a Bengali or Tamil, then you are a Banerjee or Chatterjee, or whether you are a Reddy, or whether you are a Pillai, or whatever it is called, then comes next. First thing, where you come from. Then normally people say, for example, in Orissa, suppose a person comes from Cuttack, he will be known as Katkia. Then suppose a person coming from Madurai, he will be called Madurayai. So that means, man of this place. This is how the new people will identify. So I found I have a separate study done about the Bengali surname. I am yet to publish it. You'll be surprised to know that many surname which we think that it's except there are certain titular surnames, many Bengali surnames, Oriya surname, and Bihari surnames, most of the North Indian surnames are actually place names within India or outside India. And then in South, normally people don't use the surname, but their surnames also place name. Over a period of time, we don't even being aware of the fact that my surname is a place name. Then it becomes the caste identity for the marriage purpose and some other purposes. So we use that as a surname. Otherwise, most of the Indian surname, like elsewhere in the world, it's a universal phenomenon. It's all basically place name based. And I do agree there are some places surnames are occupation based and titular based, but it doesn't take away the merit of the theory which I am talking about.
Sir, about Brahui?
Brahui actually, yes, in the Indus context, Brahui is considered, people even use the word called Brahui, problem of Brahui. So Brahui is from the bolt from blue, somewhere in the Indus region. Brahui, there is an excellent books have been written. I am thoroughly familiar with that particular language and the books written about the vocabularies and the lexical encoding process, the phonetic values, the numerals, and the many grammatical structures. So it's a Dravidian language, and unbelievably, there are certain terminology which is associated with the very ancient proto-form, which is comparable. The Brahui is more comparable geographically, because even when the Dravidian languages are classified, we put the Indian map in front of us, the way we are having Indian map. So we link the Brahui and the Krook language spoken in the Orissa, Jharkhand border by the Oran people, and in Mal Pagadia, near in Bihar, Jharkhand area, in the Sundar Pahad region. I have been there, and there is a language spoken by the Mal Pahadias. It's a Malto language, and there is a Nepali, in the Nepal, there is a one small Dravidian language is spoken by a very few hundred people. There is an enclave of a Dravidian language in Nepal. And then I think I want you to read the Sunit Kumar Chatterjee and many people who talk about the substratum of Dravidian. He goes to the level of, he has made a very sweeping statement. But I don't know whether that studies have been taken forward. The pre-Aryan and the Dravidian elements he has spoken. Like for example, the East India, you will find it's a confluence of many streams. The Indian history has to be reconstructed not in a unitary way. It is multi-layered, layer after layer. There is something tribal layer. There is something like a kind of a pre-Aryan and a non-Aryan layer. Then a subsequent layer, the recent layers, European and the Western educated, something like that. We are layer after layer. We are a beautiful country. We are a beautiful narrative of pluralism. And what we need to is celebrate our pluralism. And then that's what basically, you see, why in any Indian village, the goddess is always, the village goddess is only female. Then whereas in the, how many female goddesses are celebrated in the ancient Sanskrit text? So that means that female goddess worship, you have to straight away link to the Indus Valley civilization and other locations where the female form. I think Bengal is one particular location where the female goddess they basically worshipped with a very great devotion. And for that matter, Brahui is a very important aspect in particular field. And I have done numerous studies, and particularly that entire area of folklore is a phenomenon. But then you can't say simply because there is a Brahui spoken there, that Brahui speaking people are the direct descendant of the Indus Valley urban merchants or the town planners, because that has such a huge civilization could not have been in the current life of the Brahui. Brahui people right now, they are a very tribal kind of life. Whereas the sophistication of the Indus Valley civilization has to be matched only with the sophistication of the Sangam literature, which talks about the urban life and the maritime life.
Thank you very much, sir. Someone can raise some of the issues. Yeah.
So is any questions more from the participant side?
Yes, ma'am. I am Satish Kumar.
You please unmute your video and audio, and then you tap, and then again you mute it.
Okay. Hello. Can you hear me, sir?
Yeah. Your video is not on, but I can hear you, Satish Kumar.
Okay, sir. Thank you. First of all, I thanks Mr. Balakrishnan sir for this nice lecture. Though I am from Tamil Nadu, I have heard of his lecture previously, but still there are a lot of new information he has given. It is very nice to hear all these things. But one thing I want to still there is a haunting memory on this. Whether Tamilians are migrated from Tamil Nadu to northwestern region of Tamil Nadu, India, or they are coming from northwestern to India, Tamil Nadu. This is the question. It's been in a dilemma for the past 20 or 30 years. Sir, please kindly elaborate that particular part. That's my question, sir.
This is a very ticklish question, but I have no problem in taking this question because with this question only my studies took almost about 30-35 years because basically, as I was introduced, I am a student of Tamil literature.
Yes, sir.
And I studied a bachelor degree in Tamil literature and a master degree in Tamil literature. And I have studied nothing else.
Yes, sir.
And that whatever I do right now in my professional job, whether it's a finance or conducting elections in India, or whatever I do, it's all subsequently what I learned and practiced, and the language which I acquired, and many Indian languages which I am able to understand, and a couple of the languages I am able to speak. Everything is subsequent to that. So that means this statement I am making because I am also brought up in an environment, particularly as a student of Tamil literature, with the traditional beliefs and what we believed it based on the available information. Because there is something called history is carried in around the neck by the people. People carry their history, their own narrative in their heads. That is how we have a narrative built on the migration. So we have to, before getting into the question of whether north to south or south to north, first we have to admit that Tamil prehistory narratives are dotted or built upon the narratives connected with the displacement. Yes or no? The answer is yes. Because the Tamil prehistory narrative itself talks about the Kadal Cold, that means tsunami type major disaster associating ocean, and then changing of the capital from the first Tenmadurai, then to Kabadapuram, then to the present Madurai. That means three dislocations. Dislocation is not a small minor location. The kings are traveling and creating a new capital mean they have traveled and the displacement. You have to take as an evidence for the dislocation. So that means Tamil prehistory clearly identifies natural disasters. Sola prehistory talks about the sand casting of the capital. Pandian memory talks about the ocean-related tragedies. And the Chera recall about the curse and the capital towns getting vanished. So that means there is a displacement is built into the recalled memories of the Tamil narrative. First, we have to admit. Dislocation means what? Dislocation means from one location, you are getting into a new location. That means travel. That means journey. Without a travel, whether it's a voluntary journey or involuntary forced one, a travel is a travel. A journey is a journey. Any displacement. Today, we just now saw that thousands of people walking in the Indian national highways. Who are they? They are the migrants. What do you call them? It's a migrant. Whether something not forced. Suppose given a chance, he would have lived in his village. Because he's not having a livelihood, he is forced to go. Now the Indians have gone to Gulf, and from a lot of people from Kerala and Africa. I have been to Africa. I think in Africa, then sometimes some places you go in Tanzania, you wonder whether you are in Africa or in India. There is a Patel state, statues, and then letters are written in Gujarati script, because there are a lot of traders are living there in Africa. And today, now in America, I think 1/3 of the doctors are in British is in Indian doctors. So that means travel is inbuilt. You cannot build a narrative of a human history without with ignoring the travel. So travel is a journey was there, displacement was there. Then the question of direction, because we have binaries in the Sangam time itself, the Aryan Dravidian. I'm not using that's a racial thing. I'm talking about an ideology and also talking as a linguistic identity. This binary started coming to picture. A lot of people who do not know Tamil Nadu, they always identify, because not many people do not have the very clear idea about the southern geography and southern demography. Normally, you will have a tendency. When I lived in Chennai, Delhi, and other places, normally people tell Madrasi. That means whether he is from Kerala or from Andhra, whether it's Karnataka, whether he's from Kudagu region or from anywhere, it's all called Madrasi, because it's a vague idea. So that way we have a vague ideas about the people. But then the binary started coming to picture. North, south, northern language, southern language, Sanskrit, Tamil. This binary started coming to picture during Sangam period itself. Then modern political narrative, when it was built around the Dravidian ideology and all, we have a more tendency when the Lemuria continent theory. So then that means we have a tendency to build our narrative from that particular tendency from the south to north, whereas the evidence is showing otherwise. Right now, the current evidence, I will build it, my own studies placed in evidence, and the evidence available in the Sangam literature, absence of that detail in the northern literature, presence of that detail in the southern literature, and the overall now DNA studies. Now, finally, ultimately, the genetic studies are creating a clear markers. Who is the early Indians? What is the element of the Iranian hunter-gatherer and the farmers? And how the Megargar and that region, the Indus Valley civilization, Yemen, how the Austro-Ostric speaking people come as a stream, how all mix, and how the south. So I now, having been equipped with my book and all the evidence, now I am not really worried about the north-south direction of the thing. The evidence shows that there has been a huge dislocation and there has been a huge journey from the Indus region into Tamil Nadu. That is what my finding. It does not mean, a lot of people are feeling worried. It does not mean that before the people coming from the northwest to south, was there a Tamil Nadu, there was no human being. That is not the answer. There were human beings. They may be a Paleolithic people, Neolithic people, but they have nothing to do with the foreign trade. And whereas the foreign trade and other things come from the contact with Indus.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much.
If any questions from participants, or shall we conclude?
Hello.
Sir, please introduce your name and unmute your video also, and then you ask the questions.
My name is Kumaran, and it's very interesting about what you said, how many of these Jati names actually is past names. I actually noticed that in some villages in Tamil Nadu, actually people also have house names. For example, I mean, in my own ancestral village, the history says that, we are actually immigrants from the north, and there was 16 house that was divided into two, North Street and South Street, and each house has its own name. And I was wondering whether, if these house names could also have been formerly, village names from where they actually migrated from. And I'm very interested to do this place name study for the house names that is available in my ancestral village. And I was wondering if you could let us know, I mean, how actually do you go about doing this kind of geographic place name research?
Yeah, Mr. Kumaran, if I get your name correct.
That's right.
Yeah. It's you are on dot. I have done a lot of case studies on what is called in different locations. It is known as in Andhra. It is known as Inti Peru. That means it's a house name. And then in Kerala, it is known as the Illam pair, Vitu pair. So that means a lot of Kudi pair, Vitu pair. And then in the Kongu region, it is called Kutam. Among the Kongu agricultural people, they have a territory, and then there is something called Kaniyur. Kaniyur means foundational villages, and then Kutam pair. That means which Kutam they belong. So it's a kind of Kutam pair is a kind of exogamous. That means they will not marry within the Kutam. That means one Kutam, if a person belongs to one Kutam, that Kutam, whosoever Kutam, wherever he lives, that he is like a brother and sister. He cannot marry within the Kutam. So he has to match with some other Kutam for the marriage relationship. If you really look at it, the kinship and the caste formation, uniclan and multiclan villages throughout India, it came with the need for avoiding what is known as a taboo marriage relationship. It is to basically to create, it's a kind of a sustaining the lineage and the avoiding inbreeding. It's a great scientific concept. That is how this is built around. Over a period of time, we built the narratives of the caste and we made a mess out of it. But otherwise, it was basically based on the requirement, the supply of human, in the sense that male-female ratio. There's a lot of reason behind it. I have done extensive studies about this house names, Illam pair, Inti pair, and that becomes the very narrative of that particular family. It is also indicative, as you rightly said, indicative of the past migration. Italy in Orissa, among the people, the Paikos and Kandayat community people, they divide themselves as the Taksin Kapat, Uttar Kapat. Taksin Kapat, Uttar Kapat means that's the southern gate and the northern gate. Throughout India, you travel anywhere in India. I'll tell you, I have made it a point, wherever I get a point, I talk to some people, local people, and their migration stories are phenomenal, I'll tell you. There is a migration stories, our history is made of migrations only. And that recalled memory will become, we have a tendency to put all the previous past, unknown past into a known past. There will be a long period of the unknown past. So all this unknown past will put together and put it deposited in a known past. Suppose my name is, I am Balakrishnan, my father, my grandfather, then his father, something like that. We all may have knowledge of the 2 generation or 3 generation. Beyond that, very few people maintain that kind of family record. After that, all our ancestors become merged into one, taken our great-grandfathers, ancestors. So all the ancestors become put into one particular casket. Like that, the entire history will be into the known history. If you go to Madurai, any fellow who talks the story, there was a time, there was a king. So then he will basically relate to a known past, Nayaka period, and some known period. So that means you have these family histories and migration history get merged into the community history and the territorial history. And I'll tell you, if this is what called substratum. A national history has to be a sum total of the substratum history. That means the local history is put together, only a national history can be built. Otherwise, the narrative will be different, because the narrative, that is what the history making is a very complex process. One has to be very, very careful. I have a great regard for because the common man has got no intention to tell a lie. Why is caring in his mind, his family history, what is he? He is not wanting to be a part of the history. He doesn't think that he is an Asoka. He doesn't think that he is a Chandragupta Maurya. And that kind of dream maybe with the leaders and others may be there, or they may can hire history people, or the historians can get hired. But the common people have no agenda. So common people carry their history in a very abstract way and in a carried forward memory. If you build all the story, I don't know, you know that you'll be interested to know. I connect a lot of things. Surname with the place name, I will follow. Then I will suppose I meet a particular group of people. You call it a caste or a particular occupational group. I will check with them immediately. Where are your villages, your relatives are living? I will note down all their places. I will read something about their traditional accounts. All place names I will note down. I will immediately ask, which is your deity? That means in Tamil, you know that Kula Deivam or Ishta Deivam. Kula Deivam's concept is there. And normally people go to that particular temple and go and do the first tamsuring of the child is born, the Mottayadital. And that tamsuring festival, normally people will relate to the Kula Deivam temple. He may be working in Malaysia, he may be in Australia, he may be in America. The child may be born in America, then they will come for the holiday in Tamil Nadu, they will go to the temple and transfer and go. I track that. So this tracking I have done with reference to a particular group of people in Orissa. And then you keep asking, then you find that what is the place that particular temple is located. Then you will be surprised to know that using that identity, the location of their temple locality, and then I found that wherever this group of people moved, and along with that particular place, that particular temple place also moved. Sarasara, there's a place name. Then by tracking that alone, I just, whether you reach the head from the tail or the tail from the head, these are the markers. How you see the DNA markers, I consider this as a linguistic markers. So the Toda migration I did as a huge study. I'm going to publish that. A lot of things I have written, many of my manuscripts are unpublished. Now only I could have a time to do a publication last year of my book. This Toda case study also is yet to be published, but I spent many years in studying this Nilgiris Toda migration and how the buffaloes migrated with them, how they locate the previous identity. Then we are now, some people are involved in making the DNA markers of that particular type of buffalo. When we track that particular buffalo migration route and the migration routes of the Todas, and it take you to the same place. And then all these places you are finding the place name marker. So I build a bridge using many markers. Place name is one such marker. I entirely agree that the house name, family names, all these markers have to be used as a kind of like the way you take some kind of sample studies. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. By the way, just want to understand. I mean, if we are interested in doing this kind of place name research, I mean, would you give us some suggestion of how we can go about doing it on our own?
Yeah. You can come in my inbox, or you can collect my email ID from Lakshmi, and then I'll be happy to be answering. And also because a lot of people are even now in touch with me from abroad and many other higher educational thing wanting to do some studies in association with me. I'm also thinking of some kind of mathematical model, the prediction model and mathematical model, because I have done in an informal way some targeted studies and random sampling studies and the random statistics and targeted statistics to validate. But then I would like to do it in an elaborate way, build an algorithm and some kind of very clear empirically to provable models.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. I have one more question. I noticed that there are some words in Tamil, in Sangam Tamil and Old Tamil that seems to suggest that the roots of these words may actually have come from Sumerian language, and I am wondering if actually that could also be evidence of the Dravidian connection to Indus Valley civilization. For example, I mean, if you look at the word lion, I mean, lion is, like you have pointed out, it's alien to Tamaracam geography. But but the old word for lion is Arima, and if you look at Sumerian language, the tale of Gilgamesh, the word for lion is Urima, and the thing is, Ur itself, it means a beast or an animal, and we use the word Urumudal in Tamil to talk about growling. So I'm wondering if some of these words in Tamil, which has a context which is alien to context of Tamaracam, could have actually come from external sources, which might actually point to Dravidian connections to Indus Valley.
Yeah, precisely, because you mentioned about the Gilgamesh that thing. You know that if the important the iconographic picturized depiction of the Gilgamesh story is that a kind of a warrior hitting from both sides 2 lines. You must have noticed that you Google for Gilgamesh, you will see that there are 2 hands. The both side he will be hitting 2 lines. Both sides of the line will be there. Whereas when you come to the Indus Valley, the exactly same image, instead of 2 lines, there will be 2 tigers.
That's right.
See, imagine, it cannot accidentally happen. You have a clear, see, the 2 artists won't get it in the simultaneously. But here the Indus man put it in the tiger because that he is familiar with the tiger. but the concept is same. So even today, if you go to Tamil Nadu, it's called Pulikuttikal. And near this Kodumanal, this Arirur and Karur side, I have now come across some of the depiction of one person hitting two tigers. I have in many places I have seen one man, one tiger. It is called Pulikuttikal, and the Veerakkal and Adugal and all. In Tamil Nadu, we have recently found one particular person and two tiger, exactly same way in Indus, which is comparable with one man with two lion. So the connectivities are very clear. Actually, that even the Indus people were very, very familiar with the source of lapis lazuli somewhere in the place called Sartugai in Afghanistan, which is 1900 kilometers from the major Indus cities. 1900 kilometers in the very difficult terrain. These guys have gone and established a colony there, and it is an Indus settlement with the pottery. They must have gone with the families and group. They lived there. And similarly, in the Sumeria, you said that there is a place where they are known as Melugans. These Melugans are, they say that in the Sumerian documents are saying they were living there and doing the business there, and they were using some kind of translators. That's what the people, Airavada Mahadevan and Asko Parpola and Rovila Thapur and all talked something about this Meluga being the identity. Melagam, Sangam, Airavada Mahadevan says. My article is very much available in the Harappa.com, or you can just Google for Balakrishnan, the high west, low east dichotomy of Indus cities, a Dravidian paradigm. If you see that, it's a full-length article published in 2012, where I talked about the terminology of the east and west, how the east is equal to low and west is equal to high, and then how the east and west names, direction names, in the Dravidian paradigm and Tamil paradigm, it follows a topographical approach. That means a topocentric approach, whereas in the Indo-Aryan languages and Sanskrit and other languages, it follows an anthropocentric approach, like a front and back, Purva Paschim, that kind of concept. It's a west and east is look like with a reference to a ego, a person looking at the side where the sun is coming. What is in front of him is the east. That is the anthropocentric. Whereas what is above him is the west, and what is below him is the east, the Hillman's approach. That is what I think Hillman's approach and the other person's approach, which I have dealt with in a linguistic encoding process. That's again a new type of study. And that article only, my mentor, we lost him last year, Airavada Mahadevan sir. His last article, basically based on this particular east-west, low east and high west hypothesis, he has acknowledged that, and it's a fact, and it's a whole all interconnected thing. That is the reason we need to come out of that old concept of the Kumarikandam, Lemuria, and we should not get stuck. I strongly believe that there is a huge connection of the early Tamils with what is known as a great Indus civilization, and they are very closely linked to the authors of the Indus civilization.
Thank you so much. I think now we are coming to the end of the session. I request Dr. Parthasarathy Das, Assistant Library Information Officer, to propose the vote of thanks.
Good evening to all. So, am I audible? Am I audible?
You are.
Yeah. So,
Yes.
On behalf of the Director General, National Library, and on my personal behalf, I extend my heartfelt gratitude to Dr. R. Balakrishnan, who is an Indus researcher from Indus Research Center of the Raja Muthaiya Research Library. And he is not only a senior bureaucrat, and I was spellbound by his lecture. And when I have seen that he has carried his research for 35 years, and how he has made the Indus research into such an interesting and scientific study. Surely, sir, we are very happy to, we are very fortunate from National Library to host this type of program under Ek Bharat Shrestha Bharat. And you have invented a theory how place names are used to track the mapping of Sangam namescape. So it's a very interesting study we have learned from here. And literature, how literature meets archaeology. So thank you, sir, for such a nice lecture. And thank you, one and all the participants. Gajalakshmi for hosting the program, and my team from the National Library who has helped in doing the program. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you for everything.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you very much.
Library, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hमारे game